Silence as he dusted himself off. The whole scene in the room at Andover was before his eyes, and he knew intuitively that he had been wrong again. This man's strength, his rest, was the protection of his family. He had more use for his seat in the streetcar than any young girl. "It's all right," said Samuel gruffly. "Don't touch him. I've been a damn fool." Of course it took more than an hour or a week for Samuel to rearrange his ideas on the essential importance of good form. At first he simply admitted that his wrongness had made him powerless, as it had made him powerless against Gilly. But eventually his mistake about the workman influenced his entire attitude. Snobbishness is, after all, merely good breeding grown dictatorial. So Samuel's code remained, but the necessity of imposing it upon others had faded out in a certain gutter. Within that year his class had somehow stopped referring to him as a snob. Section 3. After a few years, Samuel's university decided that it had shone long enough in the reflected glory of his neckties, so they declaimed to him in Latin, charged him $10 for the paper, which proved him irretrievably educated, and sent him into the turmoil with much self-confidence, a few friends, and the proper assortment of harmless bad habits. His family had by that time started back to shirt sleeves through a sudden decline in the sugar market, and it had already unbuttoned its vest, so to speak, when Samuel went to work. His mind was that exquisite tabula rasa that a university education sometimes leaves, but he had both energy and influence, so he used his former ability as a dodging halfback in twisting through Wall Street crowds as a runner for a bank. His diversion was women. There were half a dozen. 2 or 3 debutantes, an actress in a minor way, a grass widow, and one sentimental little brunette who was married and lived in a little house in Jersey City. They had met on a ferry boat. Samuel was crossing from New York on business. He had been working several years by this time, and he helped her look for a package that she had dropped in the crush. "Do you come over often?" he inquired casually. "Just to shop," she said shyly. She had great brown eyes and the pathetic kind of little mouth. "I've only been married 3 months, and we find it cheaper to live over here." Does your husband like you being alone like this?" She laughed a cheery young laugh. "Oh, dear me, no. We were meant to meet for dinner, but I must have misunderstood the place. He'll be awfully worried." "Well," said Samuel disapprovingly, "he ought to be. If you'll allow me, I'll see you home." She accepted his offer thankfully, so they took the cable car together. When they walked up the path to her little house, they saw a light there. Her husband had arrived before her. "He's frightfully jealous," she announced, laughing apologetic. "Very well," answered Samuel rather stiffly. "I'd better leave you here." She thanked him, and waving a good night, he left her. That would have been quite all if they hadn't met on Fifth Avenue one morning a week later. She started and blushed and seemed so glad to see him that they chatted like old friends. She was going to her dressmaker's, eat lunch alone at Taine's, shop all afternoon, and meet her husband on the ferry at 5. Samuel told her that her husband was a very lucky man. She blushed again and scurried off. Samuel whistled all the way back to his office, but about 12 o'clock he began to see that pathetic, appealing little mouth everywhere, and those brown eyes. He fidgeted when he looked at the clock. He thought of the grill downstairs where he lunched, and the heavy male conversation thereof. And opposed to that picture appeared another, a little table at Taine's with the brown eyes and the mouth a few feet away. A few minutes before 12:30 he dashed on his hat and rushed for the cable car. She was quite surprised to see him. "Why, hello," she said. Samuel could tell that she was just pleasantly frightened. "I thought we might lunch together. It's so dull eating with a lot of men." She hesitated. "Why, I suppose there's no harm in it. How could there be?" It occurred to her that her husband should have taken lunch with her, but he was generally so hurried at noon. She told Samuel all about him. He was a little smaller than Samuel, but oh, much better looking. He was a bookkeeper and not making a lot of money, but they were very happy and expected to be rich within 3 or 4 years. Samuel's grass widow had been in a quarrelsome mood for 3 or 4 weeks, and through contrast he took an accentuated pleasure in this meeting. So fresh was she, and earnest, and faintly adventurous. Her name was Marjorie. They made another engagement. In fact, for a month they lunched together 2 or 3 times a week. When she was sure that her husband would work late, Samuel took her over to New Jersey on the ferry, leaving her always on the tiny front porch after she had gone in and lit the gas to use the security of his masculine presence outside. This grew to be ceremony, and it annoyed him. Whenever the comfortable glow fell out through the front windows, that was his congé, yet he never suggested coming in, and Marjorie didn't invite him. Then, when Samuel and Marjorie had reached a stage in which they sometimes touched each other's arms gently, just to show that they were very good friends, Marjorie and her husband had one of those ultra-sensitive, super-critical quarrels that couples never indulge in unless they care a great deal about each other. It started with a cold mutton chop or a leak in the gas jet, and one day Samuel found her in Taines with dark shadows under her brown eyes and a terrifying pout. By this time Samuel thought he was in love with Marjorie, so he played up the quarrel for all it was worth. He was her best friend, and patted her hand and leaned down close to her brown curls when she whispered in little sobs what her husband had said that morning. And he was a little more than her best friend when he took her over to the ferry in a hansom. "Marjorie," he said gently when he left her as usual on the porch, "if at any time you want to call on me, remember that I am always waiting, always waiting." She nodded gravely and put both her hands in his. "I know," she said. "I know you're my friend, my best friend." Then she ran into the house, and he watched there until the gas went on. For the next week Samuel was in a nervous turmoil. Some persistently rational strain warned him that at bottom he and Marjorie had little in common, but in such cases there is usually so much mud in the water that one can seldom see to the bottom. Every dream and desire told him that he loved Marjorie, wanted her, had to have her. The quarrel developed. Marjorie's husband took to staying in New York until late at night, came home several times disagreeably overstimulated, and made her generally miserable. They must have had too much pride to talk it out, for Marjorie's husband was, after all, pretty decent. So it drifted from one misunderstanding to another. Marjorie kept coming more and more to Samuel. When a woman can accept masculine sympathy, it is much more satisfactory to her than crying to another girl. But Marjorie didn't realize how much she had begun to rely on him, how much he was part of her little cosmos. One night, instead of turning away when Marjorie went in and lit the gas, Samuel went in too, and they sat together on the sofa in the little parlor. He was very happy. He envied their home, and he felt that the man who neglected such a possession out of stubborn pride was a fool and unworthy of his wife. But when he kissed Marjorie for the first time, she cried softly and told him to go. He sailed home on the wings of desperate excitement, quite resolved to fan this spark of romance no matter how big the blaze or who was burned. At the time he considered that his thoughts were unselfishly of her. In a later perspective he knew that she had meant no more than the white screen in a motion picture. It was just Samuel, blind, desirous. Next day at Taines, when they met for lunch, Samuel dropped all pretense and made frank love to her. He had no plans, no definite intentions, except to kiss her lips again, to hold her in his arms and feel that she was very little and pathetic and lovable. He took her home, and this time they kissed until both their hearts beat high. Words and phrases formed on his lips. And then suddenly there were steps on the porch. A hand tried the outside door. Marjorie turned dead white. "Wait," she whispered to Samuel in a frightened voice, but in angry impatience at the interruption he walked to the front door and threw it open. Everyone has seen such scenes on the stage. They see them so often that when they actually happen people behave very much like actors. Samuel felt that he was playing a part, and the lines came quite naturally. He announced that all had a right to lead their own lives, and looked at Marjorie's husband menacingly, as if daring him to doubt it. Marjorie's husband spoke of the sanctity of home, forgetting that it hadn't seemed very holy to him lately. Samuel continued along the lines of the right to happiness. Marjorie's husband mentioned firearms and the divorce court. Then suddenly he stopped and scrutinized both of them. Marjorie in pitiful collapse on the sofa, Samuel haranguing the furniture in a consciously heroic pose. "Go upstairs, Marjorie," he said in a different tone. "Stay where you are," Samuel countered quickly. Marjorie rose, wavered, and sat down, rose again, and moved hesitatingly towards the stairs. "Come outside," said her husband to Samuel. "I want to talk to you." Samuel glanced at Marjorie, tried to get some message from her eyes. Then he shut his lips and went out. There was a bright moon, and when Marjorie's husband came down the steps,